Today I'm going to be taking a look at a cool independent brand out of France called Sartory Billard. Very interesting watches, lots of customization options, and there's not a lot of reviews out there, so let's get into this one. We have a diameter of just about 40 millimeters, lug to lug of 45, height of 11, and a lug width of 20 millimeters. Some other general specifications for this watch, we're going to have the STP313 movement beating away in here. This is regulated in-house by Sartory Billard. We also do have a stated water resistance of 30 meters, just a regular push-pull crown to it. There is a box sapphire crystal on the front, regular sapphire crystal on the back. So other than that, the watch is retailing for around 3,600 euros, at least when you go for a guilloche version like mine is. You can go slightly cheaper if you just don't do the guilloche, or slightly more expensive if you do the guilloche, or you just mix two different dial materials, or dial patterns, I should also say. Another thing to keep in mind is that the wait time for this watch from kind of starting of the design and completion of the design to actual getting it in your hand is usually about 6 to 8 months or so. So starting off here with the dial, and this is definitely the most interesting part about the watch, at least in my opinion. Here we have this beautiful guilloche pattern done in this very vibrant blue. The dial itself is done by a company owned by Kari Voutilainen, and the titanium bluing process, I believe, is done in-house by Sartory. So the dial itself does start off as just regular titanium that the guilloche is then applied to, and then when Sartory gets its hands back on the dial, they do a certain in-house process that allows them to heat treat it or oxidize it and get that coloration properly. You can have a very wide range of colors to choose from, and I went for this very deep, interesting blue here. What's really nice about Sartory Billard in general is you get to design your watch. You get to design the dial pattern, the color, the indices, the handset. And with this design here in particular, I just really liked how well all the elements blended together. I really liked how the alpha handset pairs really well with the 5-minute markers that have a similar shape to them. I really like the kind of cursive Arabic/brigade numerals. To me, it all just looks very classy, very elegant. One thing I will note is that the seconds track is all highly polished, which is nice when you have it at angles like this, where it all completely lights up and looks gorgeous. But when you have it at angles like this, it's a little harder to see, or like this, kind of more dead on, it just almost looks illegible. Had I gone for something more brushed, it would have been a little more legible, or if there was multifaceted angles on the actual hour track itself, it would have been more legible. But as it stands, of course it's not perfect, but I think it still does look nice. Digressing slightly, I think I just like how intricate the dial design can be. You have this very defined outer minutes track. You have the mix of Arabics and kind of these, again, alpha style markers. An almost sector type feel. You have this very defined outer sector that holds all the numbers. You have this inner sector that really only holds the hands and the guilloche. So each element just kind of shines on its own and comes together to, I think, make something that's really gorgeous to look at. Overall, I do like the way the polished indices, or really just polished everything, catch the light, play with the light a little bit. One thing to note is, as you can kind of see, the hands themselves are a little bit more bent, a little bit more three-dimensional than the rest of the dial. So they stay pretty illuminated, pretty legible no matter what angle you have them at, whereas like an angle like this, you can't really see the hour track that well, but you can see the hands very legibly. And lastly, something I think is really interesting is the text is kept very minimally. We just have Sartory Billard out down here at the bottom. And at the end of the day, you can actually just forego the brand name entirely and have just a very sterile dial with only your design cues on it. I do personally like having the name there just because obviously this brand is where I got the watch from. But I probably would have preferred maybe if we could have like a 3D cut down somewhere in here that would also say Sartory Billard. I think it just looks a little bit more at home at the 12. And there is a little bit of empty space, but I think that's also kind of made up for by the amount of space the guilloche takes up. And then right before we just take a look at this under macro, I just want to say how crazy cool the guilloche is. Not only is the depth of the pattern really nice and apparent, but the depth of the color as well. At certain off angles, you get a very dark, almost matte blue. At other angles, you get these brighter blue tones that pop out. You get a subtle sunburst that pops out. The texture kind of appears and disappears. So it is a very lively dial, a very lively texture. And it's really just nice to see and nice to kind of play with on wrist. So zooming in here on the dial, as we can see, there's a lot to look at, and it's finished pretty well. The guilloche in particular, I think, stands out very nicely. It's very three-dimensional. Depending on the angle, it disappears, appears. There's different shapes that come out, from like more triangles to circles to just very weird shapes, but very cool shapes to see. And you can also see there is like a kind of a gentle roughness to the pattern itself, just from the process that cuts out the guilloche, and I think it looks very interesting. Focusing for a second on the more applied elements, as we can see, the hour hand here is done really well. It is high polished. There is a little bit of like, I guess you can say imperfection or maybe weirdness in the metal near that very base of the skeletonized hand. At the end of the day, I don't think that's a really major aspect. It is still pretty well done. It looks pretty well finished. And again, you do have that very gentle curvature that really plays with the light. By contrast, here you can see the hour hand is a little bit rougher. There's a little bit more dimpling in the surface. There's almost like a little bit of a gunk or residue that was left behind. When my watch was first delivered, and I'll maybe try to include a photo or video below, there was a little bit of like almost glue or paste that was on the hand. And it seems like in the process of taking it off, there was a little bit damage to the surface itself, but it doesn't look too terrible. It is almost like the polished surface became slightly more brushed than it is supposed to be. But from kind of bird's eye wrist view, you can't really see that at all. But it is just something I think I should mention. Moving on to the numerals of the track themselves, as you can see, there's like a little bit of roughness in the metal as well. It's nothing too major, and I think for like the level of detail and customization you get, I think it's fair to say that it's there. At the end of the day, this is not a 20, 40 grand watch. This is a $4,000 watch. So some of these imperfections, and they're not even really that major, I think are to be expected. So the metal cutouts aren't necessarily perfect. They do have a little bit of fuzziness, a little bit of roughness, but again, when you're kind of just wearing it, when it's on the wrist, when it catches the light, it doesn't look harshly done, and it's not like there's scratches everywhere that you set your eyes on. So I think for the price and for what you get, this is definitely a well done dial. And then stopping the hands just so we can see it, as you can see, there's like this tiny little almost copper colored thing that's popping out from the guilloche. Apparently that is like a little piece of the pattern that didn't get the color process done correctly to it. I reached out to Armand about it, and he said, you know, that is kind of the weirdness of bluing the titanium. Sometimes it turns out perfect. Sometimes you get these little tiny particles that don't turn out quite right. That's kind of part of the handmade process. It's a little bit of a quote-unquote maker's mark to the dial. At most angles, again, it kind of disappears, it kind of fades into the color itself, but at certain angles, like let's say right there, it does pop out very much at you. So it is a little bit unfortunate to see, but thankfully it's kind of covered by the hand stack a lot of the time, so not the biggest deal, but it definitely is there. Looking in some natural sunlight, as we can see, it does look pretty nice. The blue is, I guess you can say, softer than it is when it's inside. It's a little bit more uniform in its color. But you can see, depending on the angle, it really changes from the dark blue to a light blue to just matte to shiny. It is a very living dial. Depending on what angle, of course, you can either see or not see the indices. Moving into more natural sunlight, the dial gets a little bit washed out. At some angles, it's very matte. At some angles, it's very shiny, very overwhelming. But in natural sunlight, it's also very hard to kind of read the indices and the markers, but it is what it is. So moving on to the case of this watch, and while not as interesting as the dial and kind of the customization aspects that you have with the watch itself, it still is pretty well done. We do have a 40mm case that I think wears a lot better than you would expect it to, because you have very, very short lugs. Turning it to the side, we can see the lugs are fairly stubby and they do have a nice curvature to them. So again, this watch does wear pretty well on the wrist. You can see the Sartory definitely does have a very non-traditional and interesting case shape about it, or I guess case construction rather. You can see we have this kind of middle portion which is blasted along the side here that is almost just kind of the body of the watch itself, and it's almost as if the lugs are just the housing that the middle of the case is plopped into. You do have like a little bit of clearance on each of the lugs right here. You can see kind of the lugs kind of separate from the mid case over here along this line. So it does feel a little bit piecemeal in that way, but at the end of the day, it still is integrated well. It doesn't look Frankensteined, and I think it still does kind of come together on wrist very nicely. Overall, the finishing itself is done really well. As you can see here, we have this very nice and very fine horizontal brushing along the lug tops. We have this very nice defined chamfer, vertical brushing here on the lug tops everywhere. The very slim bezel we have here, because it really is mostly all dial, but the very slim bezel that we do have is convex. It has a little bit of a curve to it and is very highly polished. It looks nice. It adds a little bit of pop of shininess to the watch. Not that the watch really needs it, but hey, it has it. We do have a crown that has a very defined knurling. It is easy to wind. It is easy to use. It is a little bit large, I think, in terms of the general design, and it does end up sticking into my wrist a little bit, but there's give and takes with every watch. And then as we can see, we do have the crown that is signed and blasted in the Sartory Billard logo. Flipping it over, I think we do have a fairly attractive case back. Obviously, the movement's not really built for the size of this watch, but that's okay. Most movements aren't anyway. What is nice is they do customize the movement and add this titanium fluted ring around the kind of a rotor. And it does move along with the rotor too, which is fun. And it also has a similar color depth to the dial itself. And it is just a really interesting point to see. You have a little bit of almost continuation from the dial design. You have just a little bit more of a point of interest on the back of the watch as well, and it just feels special. Finishing up here, we do have Sartory Billard very plainly at the top here. We have piece unique, made in France. The year it was made, the model number SB04, and you get to choose a personal engraving, whatever you would like done, and I put into the blue, because this is a very blue watch, and yeah, that is it for the Sartory, and let's get it on wrist. So moving on to how this watch wears, earlier I was wearing another very interesting boutique-y independent type brand Orage with this very interesting brown dial. And here we have the Sartory sitting on my 6.5 inch wrist. And as you can see, I think it wears perfectly. For a 40 millimeter, it definitely wears its size well. It does not feel too large by any means. It is, I guess you could say, very large visually because it is an almost all dial design and it's a very kind of relatively sparse dial at that. But the lugs are very, very short. It again, just wears well on wrist. Typically a 40 can maybe almost seem too big for me at times, but this will definitely wear well on even smaller wrist, probably even down to like maybe 5 inches. Overall, it's not really the slimmest case ever made, but it actually wears very, very well on wrist. It doesn't feel that thick. It feels pretty thin actually overall. Again, the crown is a little bit large. I think it does dig. It is kind of aggressive in its knurling, or I wouldn't necessarily say aggressive, but the grooves of the crown are very large, so they do kind of dig into the wrist. Like as you can see, I was wearing it very shortly and I already do have a couple marks there. So not the end of the world. If you wear your watch up higher, it's not going to bother you, and I've almost kind of been accustomed to wearing this watch in particular up higher because of that. But as we can see, as we have it here on the wrist, it does play with the light very interestingly. It is one of those watches where it is different at every angle, different in every lighting situation, and it will definitely keep you interested over time. And looking there, as you can see, it does sit pretty well into the wrist itself. It doesn't rise up too high. It doesn't actually dig in any way. It's just the crown that really is doing all the digging. So it is a very comfortable case to wear. It's a surprisingly well-wearing case. And I think that Sartory did a really good job here. One thing to note is the watch does use curved spring bars. The lug holes are so close to the case that you basically can't use straight spring bars. So that is a little bit annoying. It just depends on your preference of like wanting to buy other straps. Like thankfully you can buy straps straight from Sartory themselves. Moving on to some other straps, this is actually one of the straps that the watch came with itself. I originally wanted it to be more of like a lighter tan, more similar to this color. And I'll kind of show you, maybe like include a little picture of what it was supposed to look like, which I thought was a little bit lighter. But it came out to be a little bit darker than I liked, and that's okay. I think it still pairs well. It's just not quite what I was looking for. One thing I will say is the quality of the strap is very nice. It is very sturdily built. The buckle is really, really fun. It integrates really nicely into the strap itself, and it wears very closely on wrist. And one other thing I will say is that although the quick release spring bars are very sturdy, you really can't use them with your nail. I've tried to use it with my nail multiple times and my nail like basically chips. So what I found is basically you have to like get a spring bar tool and actually like use the spring bar tool on where you usually would use your finger to kind of get it in and out. I don't know if that's how they intended it to be used or if it's just a very high tolerance part of the watch, but now you know. The blue and the brown work fairly well together. The nice white stitching kind of matches whenever the indices light up really brightly. The buckle helps the watch fit fairly flat. It conforms pretty nicely, and I think it just is finished well. The logo itself is unique. It is nicely brushed. The little tang part or the pin or whatever you call this part integrates really well into the buckle keeper design. So really great strap and buckle design. I think the quick release part just needs to be toned in slightly because I don't want to break all my nails. Next we have this very nice natural Buttero leather strap from King Leathercraft. I don't believe they're making straps right now, but you can get a similar styled strap from Delugs. Just look up natural Buttero and you're pretty much on the way. I think the lighter brown works really well with this blue. It makes the watch a little bit more fun. It pops a little bit more, and let's get it on wrist. I think it pairs pretty well. It's a very comfortable strap, very comfortable type of leather, so it just ends up conforming really nicely to your wrist. And yeah, I think that's a pretty good combo overall. And now we have the classic Archer silicone strap, and I think it pairs pretty well. I cheated slightly because as you can see here, it is a 21 millimeter strap. but I used a 20mm curved spring bar, and that way you don't have any of the spring bar peeking through. It does fit the gap very well, and it, I think, just looks nice on the watch. And there we have it on wrist. Again, plants the watch very comfortably. I think it looks pretty great. When you have the watch light up and shine a little bit more, the white tones match really well. I think this is a very good strap combo and probably pretty useful if you just don't like the strap it comes on or you can't find the right strap for it. This is a good kind of interim option to put it on. So yeah, that is the Sartory. So pros and cons of this watch, and I think one of the biggest pros for it is just that there's a lot of customization to it, and it ends up just being a very unique watch. It doesn't really look like anything else out there. It doesn't look like anything else at the price point. So it's a definite just pro for this brand, for this watch, and for, I guess, the end consumer. I think the fact that you get to pick the dial, you get to pick the pattern, you get to pick what color, basically. There's so much of yourself you can put into the watch. It's a very kind of fulfilling process, and at the end of the day, again, you end up with a unique piece for a price point, which I think at the end of the day is usually not accessible for like piece uniques. And following on from that point, I think there's a lot of value for money that you get here. Again, even especially if you go with anything that has guilloche on it, it comes from Cartier-Verlainen's own company. So you're getting a little bit of that provenance to it. There's no other watch around 4K where you can just brainstorm with the creator of the brand and basically work to make the best thing possible for you. It's a really interesting position this brand is in, and of course it takes some time. You know, the lead time is like 6 to 8 months. It's not an insignificant amount of time, but I think, again, for what you're getting, for the value that's there, and for the end product, I think it's fairly worth it. And another pro, and it doesn't necessarily go to this watch, but it's more for the brand itself, there's really quick communication. I do like the fact that you can kind of just ask Armand a question and he can get back to you within probably a day or two. He gets back to you very quickly about renderings and dial designs and ideas that you may have. So it's a really nice, quick process, and you can pretty easily come to the point of a design that you really like and a design you're ready to go forward with. And one last point I do want to make is the case does wear very well. For a 40, it doesn't feel huge or cumbersome on the wrist. There definitely could have been unrefinement in the case shape or the wearing experience, and thankfully that's not the case. I guess, like, for a quick side-by-side comparison, here I have a 40mm Haraj on my wrist, and then if I switch to the Sartory, by comparison, that's the 40mm Sartory on my wrist. I can't really tell whether or not that size comparison kind of got through to you on the other side yet, but hopefully you can kind of tell. But even then, on my wrist, you can see the 40 looks perfect. It looks proportional. It looks okay. And at the end of the day, even on my smaller wrist, it still looks fine. Some 40s don't look that great on me, but this one looks fine. It wears well, and it's comfortable. So moving on to cons, and while I don't have many, there are a couple. One of the biggest cons for me is the legibility. Now, I guess part of it's my fault and part of it's Armand's fault. The fact that I went with the fully polished indices on the watch doesn't help very much. They are very one-dimensional, they're pretty flat, so at certain angles they don't really shine well. It doesn't catch the light, it looks very gray-black, and it's hard to read. Had I gone for a fully brushed hour and minutes track and handset, which Armand did suggest at some point, it would have been much more legible, but it also wouldn't have that shimmery, shiny quality to it. If there was any more three-dimensionality, if there were any more facets to the design of the printed track, then it would have a little bit more light play, a little bit more legibility. So overall, that's not really the end of the world. It still is a very good-looking watch, and I don't necessarily always need to know the time exactly, and I can also just move my wrist slightly and be able to tell the time that way. One of the biggest cons for me, actually, is the fact that the crown, I just feel, is too large and a little bit too sharp. The way I wear my watches up, I wear them a little bit higher on the wrist, and because the crown on the Sartory is, I think, maybe a little bit bigger than it needs to be, it definitely does dig into my wrist. I've kind of conceded to wearing the watch slightly higher up on my wrist, just so it doesn't bang into my actual hand so much. So that's just one slight point of improvement I think needs to be made. And my last con for this watch is, unfortunately, there are QC issues, you know? My first time I got the watch back, or I guess you could say the first time it was ever delivered to me, the hands had this like weird sticky kind of gunk on them. So I sent it back. Armand was very nice about it. He, you know, apologized up and down, and even offered to upgrade my dial, which I ended up going for. But when I got it back, it was just, while there was no gunk now, the hands were all scratched. It didn't look very pretty. This isn't hot horology. This isn't the highest end finishing that you get, and from kind of the naked eye view, it does look good. But when you zoom in a little bit closer, this is not the most immaculately finished thing out there, and if you're okay with that, that's great. If you're not and you know that will bug you, that's just something to keep in mind. So final thoughts on this watch, and I do really, really like it. When I first saw Sartory Billard, I was really interested in the brand. Again, the customization thing really just grabbed me. They're really famous, or I guess he got really famous for initially his like liquid metal dials and the way the colors are very vibrant and shiny and reflective. But for me, I don't really love that styling because as I said, it was probably very reflective, and I don't really like reflections or even sunburst style dials. But when I saw more of the guilloche work, I just thought the kind of depth of color you can create, the beautiful pattern, the three-dimensionality of it, I think for the price point, it was just amazing. So I am really happy I ended up getting one of these watches. I do enjoy it immensely. If you're just looking for something off the beaten path, you're looking for something that will stand out in your watch box, this is definitely it. Is it the best watch out there? No. But I think in terms of like the boutique-y independent brands that play in this like sub 5, sub 6K price point, this is probably one of the best that I've come across. I've dealt with Haraj, I've dealt with Fears, I've dealt with Ophion, I've dealt with Ming. And between all those, if I had to just narrow it down to one watch or one brand, it would probably be Sartory. They're the most interesting. I think you get the most bang for your buck, and I just really like it. Anyway, those are just my thoughts. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you as always for watching, and I'll see you in another one.